Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this rainy evening for the first in our fall 2022 series, Issues That Matter. It's one of our now Maine famous Wednesday night webinars. And this evening, we are going to hear from Akhil Bery of the Asia Society about the ongoing crisis in Sri Lanka. So I want to thank everybody. If you've been coming to our regular coffee and discussion meetings, you know the situation in Sri Lanka is one of these that intersects with just about all of the issues that we have been considering over the past year, and ones that will continue to be driving headlines and that we will continue to explore throughout the fall. Everything from corruption, climate, COVID, and here in particular, the changing geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. That's why we're really fortunate to have Akhil Bery with us this evening, and he's going to share his insights on this ongoing crisis. He is the director of South Asia initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute, where his research focuses on the US-India relationship, as well as South Asian political economy more broadly. He previously worked at the Eurasia Group, where he was responsible for the firm's coverage of South Asia, including political and economic developments in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Prior to the Eurasia Group, Akhil worked with McLarty Associates, where he led the research for the India and South Asia team. He has also worked at Fujitsu Research Institute in Tokyo, Japan, as well as the 9.9 Media, a B2B startup based in New Delhi. He's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has degrees from Georgetown, Franklin, and Marshall College. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We're excited to hear from you. We're also going to be joined by my friend and our colleague here at the World Affairs Council of Maine, Julie Mueller. She is, in addition to being a member of the World Affairs Council of Maine, which I personally always think is the most important part of people's biographies, she is a professor of social science at Southern Maine Community College. She is a political scientist by training, and her research focuses on the IMF and economic development. Julie is also a member of the American Political Science Association's Committee on the Status of Community Colleges in the Profession. Julie, thank you so much for moderating tonight's session for us. And before I hand things off to you, Julie, I also just very briefly need to thank our sponsors. I want to thank our partners, USM, Alan Wardell in the tech department, Thomas Mosier, Verrill Law, David Wood Clothiers, and Alan Hall and Pat Finnegan for supporting our programs this evening. Your support is really important because not only does this enable us to have these speaker series, but also enables us to make membership and admission to our programs free for Maine students. So thank you. And as always, I thank my World Affairs Council of Maine audience for being here. We will have about 20 minutes of remarks from our speaker, and then Julie will have a few moderating questions, and then you're free to ask your questions by putting them in the chat box or the Q&A. So, Julie, I'm going to turn things over to you now to start our evening.
Thanks, Allison, and welcome, Akhil, and thanks for joining us tonight. This is a topic that I'm really interested in learning more about. I think that Sri Lanka is really a rather unique country, but I'm wondering if there aren't some more general lessons that we can take from its political and economic collapse. And so I'm particularly interested in how economics and politics intersect. I know it's complicated, but could you give us a little background on how Sri Lanka got into its present political and economic situation?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on tonight. I really appreciate it and looking forward to this discussion. So as mentioned, I mean, Sri Lanka is in the worst economic crisis since independence in 1948. And this is also the first time that it has ever defaulted since independence, and is also a case study for what happens when a country can't pay its debts in the era of COVID. And so protests were ongoing for over 3 months, basically. Sri Lankans were angry about 13-plus-hour power cuts, food and medicine shortages, and it caused the old government, led by former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, to step down from his post. And eventually, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country and sent in his resignation as well. So how did kind of Sri Lanka wind up in this situation? And I would argue that this crisis has been long in the making and could potentially have been avoidable. So Sri Lanka has consistently faced what's known as a twin deficit problem, consisting of both a budget deficit and a current account deficit. So it spent more than it brought in, and it never inserted itself into the global supply chain. So it imported more than it exported. So part of the reason for that is that successive Sri Lankan governments have failed to meaningfully implement the structural reforms needed to make the country a competitive economy. So the example I like to give is that in 2000, exports of goods and services were about 39% of GDP. In 2019, that number decreased to about 20%. And it can, whether it be protectionist interests or just the inability of successive governments to implement the reforms, Sri Lanka has failed to insert itself into the global supply chain, which has made it heavily reliant on 3 sources of foreign exchange: tourism, textile exports, and remittances. And that is problematic because besides the twin deficit problem, Sri Lanka has also suffered from a debt problem. Beginning in 2007, near the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, so the Sri Lankan Civil War ended in 2009, and Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president at that time. Mahinda, just for everyone's knowledge, there are a few cast of characters that I'll keep referring to. So Mahinda Rajapaksa is the eldest brother in the Rajapaksa family. Not the eldest brother, he's the second eldest, but he was the president at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. His younger brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was the president from 2019 until this year. And Ranil Wickremesinghe has been prime minister 6 times. When Mahinda resigned as prime minister in May of this year, Ranil came in as prime minister. And when Gotabaya fled the country and resigned as president, Ranil was elected president. So these are kind of the 3 main people that I'll keep referring to. So I just wanted to give a little background. So in 2007, the Sri Lankan Civil War was starting to come to an end. And Mahinda was looking to figure out how to develop Sri Lanka's infrastructure. At the time, he looked for a number of vanity projects and turned both to the international community and international investors to raise the necessary capital. Due to Sri Lanka's political volatility, bond yields were extremely lucrative. And though he was able to raise the necessary capital and build the infrastructure, economic reforms were not implemented and populist measures continued to drain the Sri Lankan treasury. These bond payments are one of the main reasons Sri Lanka had to approach the IMF for a program in 2016, as foreign exchange reserves were falling dangerously low. The low foreign exchange reserves is also one of the reasons Sri Lanka leased 70% of Hambantota port to a Chinese company. Now, this is often cited as an example of a Chinese debt trap, but in reality, Sri Lanka badly needed the foreign exchange reserve to service its other short-term foreign debt. Loans from China currently account for about 10% of Sri Lanka's total debt, but when you include the debt owned by Sri Lankan state-owned enterprises, that number balloons to about 16 to 17%. Similarly, international sovereign bonds are about 39% of Sri Lanka's overall debt. And despite the debts looking at as it was on an unsustainable track, you never saw a government focus on economic reforms or seek to reduce its debt repayments. And instead, you start to have political crises. So this is where economics and politics start to intersect. So in 2018, Maithripala Sirisena was the president, and Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister. The two of them really did not like each other. And Sirisena tried to fire Ranil as prime minister and appoint Mahinda as prime minister. Ultimately, Sri Lankan institutions stood the test of time, and the courts reinstated Ranil as the prime minister. But the political crisis had an impact on tourism, and as a number of countries, including the UK, the EU, etc., issued travel warnings to Sri Lanka because of the political volatility. Then in 2019, you had the Easter bombing attacks, which put further pressure on Sri Lanka's fiscal situation and caused a decline in tourism. And soon after winning the presidential election in 2019, and he won by 10 percentage points, Gotabaya Rajapaksa implemented an income tax cut and a value-added tax cut, which cost the Sri Lankan treasury about 2.5% of GDP in lost revenue. So that 2016 IMF program was thrown off track. And I would argue that this is the first in the series of economic policy mistakes that explain how Sri Lanka wound up in its current state. So besides the tax cuts, to finance the tax cuts, because Sri Lanka runs a budget deficit and it spends more than it brings in, the central bank, the government had to borrow heavily from the central bank and commercial banks, increasing the money supply as it sought to keep interest rates down while financing the deficit. Though this has long been a practice in Sri Lanka, between December 2019 and August 2021, Sri Lanka's money supply increased by about 42%, because this helped lead to the foreign exchange shortages, because as Sri Lanka imports more than it exports, the increased money in circulation is spent by recipients on imports. So that helped lead to the dwindling foreign exchange reserves. 2020 was another shock to the Sri Lankan economy with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw with the strained fiscal situation, the government was not able to enact a meaningful stimulus and opted not to negotiate with its creditors to obtain debt relief, which I would argue is one of the key mistakes that Sri Lanka did, is that instead of choosing, it approached the IMF for a rapid finance instrument. It could not get that rapid finance instrument because its debt was considered to be unsustainable. And rather than negotiating with the creditors, bilateral creditors, and saying, hey, please understand, like, we're reliant on tourism. We need a lifeline right now to help us out. Can you please grant us that? They chose to try to muddle through the crisis and obtained further loans from China and negotiated currency swaps with Bangladesh, China, and India to temporarily boost the foreign exchange reserves, which were all just band-aids to a much larger problem. Then I would argue the next policy mistake of the Gotabaya presidency was this government suddenly announced a ban on chemical fertilizer, part of a broader push to pursue import substitution. So with the fertilizer ban, it's not a bad policy to try to shift to organic fertilizers, but what the government tried to do was do it overnight. And typically this sort of transition takes about 3 years. And there was a shortage of organic fertilizer in the country because the ecosystem had not been prepared. Tea is one of Sri Lanka's largest exports, and due to the fertilizer ban, crop yields were devastated. And this loss of exports was devastating for the economy, and the decline in paddy crop that came as a result of the lack of fertilizer has helped to push food inflation even higher. Though the government eventually came to its senses and reversed this decision, the damage was done. Entering 2022, the government still believed it could muddle through and come out of this debt crisis, and paid a $500 million sovereign bond in January. One of the strategies that the government pursued was to target Russian and Ukrainian tourists to come to Sri Lanka and spend their money and help boost the economy. One of my friends did the two-week quarantine at a hotel in Sri Lanka, and it was just him and Russian and Ukrainian tourists. My favorite image of that is him telling me about a person from Sri Lanka dressed up as Elvis and singing Elvis songs in Russian. So again, like that was their strategy. But after repaying that $500 million sovereign bond in January, most investors believed that Sri Lanka would not be able to pay the $1 billion sovereign bond maturing in July. And going back to what I was saying about Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine firmly diminished any of the hopes Sri Lanka had of being able to make that July repayment. At that point, commodity prices spiked, and Sri Lanka simply did not have the money to pay for essentials. At this point, the central bank had also been holding a peg on the Sri Lankan rupee. Investors recognized that Sri Lanka would not have the ability to pay, and that peg broke. And once that happened, you start to see the foreign exchange crisis come to light, and that led to a food shortage, a fuel shortage, a medicine shortage, etc. So initially, Sri Lankans took to the streets and demanded the resignation of the government for its role in getting Sri Lanka to this situation. The protests were peaceful, except for when mobs affiliated with Mahinda Rajapaksa attacked protesters who retaliated by burning down the Rajapaksa's ancestral home and attempting to storm the Prime Minister's official residence. In the first concession to protesters, Mahinda resigned as Prime Minister to make way for Wickremesinghe to take over as Prime Minister. However, this did not alleviate the protesters' concerns because they felt that there still hadn't been any accountability. And though Gota held on to power as much as he could, ultimately in July, he fled the country and emailed in his resignation from Singapore. Ranil Wickremesinghe stepped in as acting president, and on July 20th, he was voted in as president to complete the rest of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's term. Now, it's worth noting that Wickremesinghe came to power only due to the backing of the Rajapaksa's power. And Gota remains the only Rajapaksa who has fled the country. The rest of the Rajapaksa clan is still in Sri Lanka. Ranil's term as president, I would say he's probably one of the most unpopular politicians in Sri Lanka. He's a survivor, but he is unpopular. He's been Prime Minister 6 times and has never completed a term in office. He's always been kicked out ahead of schedule because either of his abrasive personality or what have you, but he has not been able to stay in power. Even during the last presidential election, he tried to run for president, but most of the members of his party deserted him. And ultimately, he entered into parliament after the last parliamentary elections in 2020, but he is the only member of his party in parliament. And he came in through the national list, which means that he did not even get elected to parliament. He had to be appointed to a seat. So that shows you kind of what the political dynamics are here and what we're dealing with. Ranil's big challenge right now are twofold. One is to stabilize the economy, and one is also to navigate the rising geopolitical tensions between India and China. So Sri Lanka on the first part on the economy, Sri Lanka is in negotiations with the IMF about a EFF package, extended fund facility. So this is typically the IMF package. If they get it and the board approves it, at that point, you will see more multilateral and bilateral financing being unlocked. Because according to Wickremesinghe, the country needs about $6 billion in additional financing this year, which will only come if the IMF program is in place. Now, since the economic crisis has started, India has really taken the lead in helping Sri Lanka. It has provided about $4 billion worth of assistance, both in loans and humanitarian assistance. In contrast, China has not been willing to engage in debt relief talks, which is what Sri Lanka really needs right now. And I would argue that one of the reasons China has not been willing to do that is because of the precedent it would set for the countries in the region. If they grant aid to Sri Lanka, then what's stopping Pakistan from asking the same thing? What's stopping Laos? What's stopping Kenya, Zambia? So it's a slippery slope that will come if China grants them debt relief. But ultimately, that's what the issue is right now, is Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable. That is clear, and that has been clear since 2020. And so an IMF mission is in Sri Lanka this week. It is set to negotiate with the government, and the government is expressing confidence that the negotiations will be concluded quickly. There is a little bit of skepticism, though, because Sri Lanka has not engaged. Yes, it has appointed legal and technical advisors on its debt restructuring. But at the end of the day, though, the international sovereign bondholders are just one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is the bilateral creditors. And this is where the geopolitical game between India and China comes into play. So India, of course, as I mentioned, has stepped in and provided a significant amount of aid to Sri Lanka and has really taken the lead of championing Sri Lanka's case in multilateral institutions such as the IMF, arguing that Sri Lanka should be redesignated as a low-income country to get access to additional concessionary financing. However, this is one of the issues, is that no investor is willing to take a haircut unless they see what China is doing. And China so far has not been willing to take said haircut. Sri Lanka has asked for relief. It's asked for help from China, and it claims that they're in negotiations with China about a $4 billion package, but that's not going to help out. What is going to help out is to get Sri Lanka's debt onto a sustainable path. And the IMF has said as much, is that while a program may be completed, they may come to the terms on the program. And sure, Sri Lanka has reversed the 2019 VAT tax cuts. It's increased oil prices. It's committed to privatizing state-owned enterprises. But those are what they will need to do once the program is approved. For the program to be approved, there needs to be progress made with the bilateral creditors, including China and India. So what Sri Lanka's strategy is right now is to approach China and try to negotiate with them about how to get the debt on a sustainable track. For context, Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio right now is about 106%. It started off at about 95%, but due to the collapse in the rupee, it's skyrocketed to about 106%. So China has been willing to talk, but it hasn't actually helped out Sri Lanka. And one of the challenges Sri Lanka faces right now is how to navigate the growing geopolitical divide between India and China. India has long held influence in the South Asia region, and these smaller states such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh now have options. And there is no better example than Sri Lanka. So during the Sri Lankan Civil War, the Chinese were very close to the Rajapaksas, providing them with weapons to help defeat the Tamil Tigers, whereas India had more sensitivities. Now, though, the pendulum is shifting more towards India, and it's been able to extract a number of concessions from Sri Lanka in exchange for its help. So, for example, in the northern area of Jaffna, the Chinese ambassador went to inaugurate some renewable energy projects there. India protested, the projects were canceled and awarded to India later on. This is to make up for various projects that Sri Lanka had canceled of India to benefit China. Now, though, the latest example of the conflict between India and China playing out in Sri Lanka was that there was a Chinese spy ship that was set to dock at Hambantota port for what they said was a refueling exercise. India, of course, was concerned about this and raised these concerns with Sri Lanka, who then told the Chinese ship it could not dock. China then turned around and said, well, if you don't let the ship dock, we're not going to help you with your debt situation. So ultimately, the ship docked after a bit of a delay. It is still there, but it points to the issue that Sri Lanka faces, is it needs debt relief from China, but it also can't alienate India because India has been championing its case and has provided a significant amount of help and assistance to the government of Sri Lanka. So ultimately, while the expectation is that it will get an IMF program, these debt dynamics are not going to go away anytime soon. And Sri Lanka still faces an extensive amount of debt repayments over the next few years. It's defaulted on its foreign loans, but how it deals with this crisis will also be a template for the rest of the region, which is also facing a bit of a fiscal crisis. So there are concerns that Sri Lanka is going to be the first domino to fall because you're seeing Bangladesh approach the IMF for a potential $4.5 billion bailout. Nepal has enough foreign exchange reserves for about 6 months worth of imports. Pakistan has reserves for about 45 days worth of imports. So there's a lot of financial issues happening in South Asia. And like I said, there are concerns that Sri Lanka could just be the first part of the tip of the iceberg.
Thanks for that. That was really, boy, there's so much going on in Sri Lanka. It's a really complicated situation. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit maybe about the ethnic and cultural divisions in the country. And I know that especially in the wake of the Easter bombings in 2019 that President Rajapaksa had a lot of backlash for his bungling of that after getting intelligence from the Indian government. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what role those play in the protests that have also been going on.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. So the 2019 Easter bombing attacks, it was the first time that we've seen sectarian violence in Sri Lanka. It was the first time you saw Muslims attacked in Sri Lanka. Typically, the violence has been ethnic. It's been the ethnic Sinhalese versus the Tamils. And this is the first time you saw Muslims get attacked. And one of the things that happened is that, yes, India did provide intelligence to Sri Lanka. And if you talk to anyone from the Indian embassy, they will say that the Indian embassy that day was a fortress. And this is also a fallout from the 2018 constitutional crisis, is that Ranil was left out of all the defense meetings, the defense council meetings. He had no idea what was going on. And on that day, all of the Sri Lankan elite were out of Colombo. That Sirisena, the president, was in Singapore. The Rajapaksas were not in Colombo. So that's led to some accusations about and questions about how much did they know, especially since President Gotabaya Rajapaksa announced his candidacy for presidency the very next week, and he ran on a national security platform. Now, how did he win by 10 points? Part of it was the national security. Part of it was the disorganization of the opposition. So Ranil was the head of the UNP. Sajid Premdasa, whose father was president of Sri Lanka, and Karo Jayasuriya all wanted to be the UNP's nominee for president. They did not select a nominee for president until October 2019, at which point Gotabaya Rajapaksa had been running for 6 months. So it was clear that he was going to run, that he was going to win. And the scale of the victory was pretty impressive as well. It was by 10 percentage points. Now, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa won, this was one of the big concerns, is because he has had a very antagonistic relationship with the ethnic Tamils in the north. And during the Sri Lankan Civil War, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's nickname was the man with the white van for disappearing various Tamil activists. And there's still been a push and a demand for justice for those activists. And this has been a long-standing part of the U.S.-Sri Lanka relationship, is the U.S. has pressed Sri Lanka to do more on providing evidence about the enforced disappearance and having some accountability for the atrocities that happened during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Now, during these protests, the protests have largely been peaceful and have been kind of united all of Sri Lanka. But there have been some concerns about the Tamil minorities, that they could be targeted by the Rajapaksas or the ethnic Sinhalese as kind of a scapegoat for the economic problems. And actually, two things I would point out here. One is that Sri Lanka still has a significant defense budget. It should not, even after the end of the Civil War, it should not have this massive defense budget. And even last year, despite the fiscal concerns, Sri Lanka's defense budget increased by about 11%. And a lot of that is the militarization of the north and the inability of the Tamils to kind of live freely there. Now, Sri Lanka's checkered history on human rights is also playing a role in the economics, because there is an upcoming resolution at the UN Human Rights Committee about whether or not to censor Sri Lanka for the crimes against the Tamils. And there is pressure to support that on the US, and this also plays into the EU. So Sri Lanka currently has Generalized System of Preferences Plus, which the GSP is a preferential tariff program. In the US, we used to have it, we don't have it anymore. The EU has GSP Plus, which means that textiles are allowed duty-free access to the EU market. Sri Lanka currently has GSP Plus access in the EU. Any backsliding on human rights issues will put that under review, and that will have another effect on the Sri Lankan economy, which could help exacerbate this crisis.
So I'm wondering mean, there's around the world, we see signs of democratic backsliding. And I know that one of the big issues in Sri Lanka has been the issue of corruption, and that the IMF's been very critical of them for this. I know that they built a big cricket stadium, I think, in their hometown that nobody uses. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of connect this. You mentioned some of the other countries in the area to some of the other like trends that are going on in terms of corruption and democratic backsliding.
So on the democratic backsliding, I mean, I would argue most countries in the region are backsliding democratically. India, of course, there are a lot of concerns about the degradation of institutions in India and the pressure that's being applied to the free press in India. In Pakistan, of course, there's always the role of the military there, especially with regards to election rigging. And right now, what we're seeing is the army switched its support to the PDM, the Pakistani Democratic Movement, and the no confidence vote motion happened that saw former Prime Minister Imran Khan lose power. He was the first Pakistani Prime Minister to lose power through a no confidence motion. Then Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has effectively developed a one-party state now. The last elections were not contested; they were boycotted by the opposition. This goes back to her unwillingness to appoint a caretaker prime minister in between elections. And in Sri Lanka, while the elections were conducted democratically in 2019 and 2020, President Ranil Wickremesinghe has so far not deviated from the playbook of his predecessors. He's been much more willing to use the military and the police to round up protesters, to attack them, to arrest them, leading to concerns about where is Sri Lanka headed. And I think that is very important to kind of keep in mind. And I'm forgetting one other point I was going to make, but what we're seeing in Sri Lanka especially is, one of the key demands of the protesters has been the abolishment of the executive presidency in Sri Lanka. So under Maithripala Sirisena, who was president before Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the pendulum was swinging much more towards the Westminster style of parliamentary democracy, where you have a symbolic executive president and you have an empowered parliament. The first act that Gotabaya Rajapaksa did when he was president was to pass the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which strengthened the executive presidency. And it took a lot of responsibility from Parliament. And though protesters have been pushing Ranil and the government to move more towards the parliamentary democracy and abolish the executive presidency, so far he does not seem to be doing that. The 23rd Amendment to the Constitution is currently working its way through the parliamentary committees, and that has been viewed with a great deal of skepticism by activists and protesters, because they believe it's just more and more of the same. Now, on the corruption point, this has been something that has been pushed for by a number of people who have had experience dealing with Sri Lanka and the IMF, is that there's been a broad push to include anti-corruption measures into any IMF program for Sri Lanka.
It seems like such a chicken egg problem always for developing countries. Like, it's hard to get rid of the corruption and fix the political issues when you are in so much debt and having so many financial problems. Which do you tackle first? And then it's problematic because they can't get the loans that they need to fix the political problems. I'm wondering, has there been any reaction from the United States government with regard to Sri Lanka?
So the US has consistently expressed that Sri Lanka needs to respect the right of protesters to protest peacefully. And Ambassador Julie Chung has been meeting regularly with Sri Lankan civil society. She's met with political officials and government officials. The issue is that the US relationship with Sri Lanka is not as strong as the India relationship with Sri Lanka. And as I mentioned before, the US relationship with Sri Lanka has really been focused on human rights and ensuring that the rights of the Tamil minority are protected. Under the Rajapaksas, the US had awarded Sri Lanka a $500 million Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, a grant, not a loan. And it was going to be used for women's empowerment, agricultural projects, etc. However, due to a significant amount of misinformation, it became wrapped up in this controversy that by having the Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, this would lead to a status of forces agreement, which would allow US troops to enter Sri Lanka and have legal immunity. That was not true. It was not true at all, but the amount of misinformation that was pervasive around that, when Ranil was Prime Minister and Sirisena was President, they were unable to get it through Parliament. And when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, he canceled it. Now, there are questions about how much influence the Chinese had in this. We see the same issue playing out in Nepal, where there was a significant amount of disinformation around the MCC loan and claiming that it would lead to a loss of sovereignty. But ultimately, the MCC loan managed to get through Parliament in Nepal in a way that it didn't in Sri Lanka. So at that time, you saw Sri Lanka and the US really have no relations. And then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo canceled his visit to Sri Lanka because of that. Ultimately, Pompeo went to Sri Lanka near the end of the Trump administration, in essence, to fly the flag and show that the US will not avoid any country just because it hasn't had traditional relations with that country. Under the Biden administration, USAID Administrator Samantha Power has had extensive dealings with the Sri Lankan government, especially on the human rights issue. And USAID has provided at least $100 million in aid to Sri Lanka. But the main thing is that it is not going to paying down the debts. It's going to the economic welfare of the Sri Lankan citizens.
Well, that's a really interesting connection that I did not know about. Allison, we have some questions in the Q&A. Did you want to?
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation, and I've got so many of my own questions brewing in my mind, but I want to give our World Affairs Council audience a chance to ask their questions. So I have a question here from Jim Pinfold. He's thanking you for your very clear history of Sri Lanka and the articulate analysis of what's happening now. Press reports indicate that Gotabaya is about to return to Sri Lanka in early September. His brother, the equally revered and disgraced Mahinda, recently told press, everybody, including me and the previous governments, will have to answer for the economic failures. How do you believe Gotabaya's return will affect the current imposed calm that is now in place, both in the capital as well as Rajapaksa's home area in the south of the country?
So I would point out that, yes, the Rajapaksas are down, but they're not out. The current government is just as unpopular, and there is no clear opposition leadership. So Sajith Premdasa is still growing into the role of opposition leader. I don't think he is quite there yet. And he is not as popular as the Rajapaksas. I mean, if you look at it, the Rajapaksas have built their brand on an ethnic Sinhalese nationalism. And that is not going to fade away overnight. And they have been down before, but they've not been out. In 2015, Mahinda had changed the constitution to run for a third term as president. Ultimately, it took the betrayal of the health minister, Maithripala Sirisena, and uniting forces with the UNP to basically overthrow Mahinda and deny him the third term as president. He did not leave the country. He stayed in the country. And for the next 4 years, him and Gotabaya waited for the contradictions of the UNP SLFP coalition to collapse, and it did. And he waited, and even in 2018, he was appointed prime minister. Mahinda was appointed prime minister, and even though his position was not upheld, Gotabaya was still able to win by 10 percentage points. And this was a shellacking throughout most of Sri Lanka. Even in the parliamentary elections in 2020, the Rajapaksa's party, the SLPP, won close to 2/3 majority, and with allies, they reached the 2/3 majority in parliament, a mere 5 years after having been kicked out of power before. So yes, there is a kind of peace right now. I think the fact that that most of the Rajapaksa clan did not flee Sri Lanka, I think that benefits them a lot, because they just are able to wait and bide their time for Ranil to make the unpopular economic decisions, fuel price hikes, tax hikes, dealing with electricity hikes. All of these are and cutting government salary, cutting the size of the public sector, cutting the size of defense. All of these are going to be unpopular decisions. So there is a huge comparison in Pakistan as well, because the current government needs to make the same decisions. They've had to raise fuel prices. They've had to raise electricity prices. They've had to do a lot. They have had to make a lot of unpopular economic decisions, which leaves the door open for Imran Khan to come back to power next year. The same thing is true for the Rajapaksas, in my opinion, is that the unpopularity of Ranil as president. I mean, on social media, Ranil is called Ranil Rajapaksa for his protecting of the Rajapaksas and not being willing to prosecute them when he was in power. So if he is very unpopular, it's not clear yet if the SJB can be a viable opposition party. So if not them, then who? The natural answer is the Rajapaksas.
Our next question is from Robin Ratcliffe. She says, while this negotiation is going on with the IMF and with all these other countries, what can be done for the people? Sri Lanka is a beautiful, interesting country. This is clearly going to be impacting tourism. Will things rebound during these unstable times? What's going to be the impact on the people, and how can the international community, surrounding countries, sort of step in and address that?
I mean, you've already seen the impact on the people. I remember talking to one of my friends in Sri Lanka who said he's changed his diet to be able to conserve calories and make it a much more calorie efficient diet. Barely goes into town anymore because there is no point, because you have to wait 2+ hours for fuel if there is fuel. So the changes on the ground have already happened, and they're likely to continue happening. Now, India has been stepping in and providing credit lines for Sri Lanka to buy fuel, to buy food, etc. I think the US has also is working with the World Food Program, increasing its donations there to make sure that there can be an increase in donations to Sri Lanka. The medicine situation seems to have eased a bit, but there will be a requirement to kind of work on providing humanitarian assistance. Now, at the same time, there are multiple crises happening in the world. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka does not rank that high on kind of the global scale. I mean, when you think of it, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how much money is being spent there, Sri Lanka just does not register. So it's come to India to do the heavy lifting, but now you're also seeing other countries step in. And one of the things that I've argued for is that this is an opportune moment for the Quad, India, the US, Japan, and Australia, to step up and show that it can respond to short-term economic crises and deliver actual meaningful relief to people on the ground to help them overcome this crisis. Japan, I think, is going to be a major player in this as well. They've been waiting for the IMF, but Ranil is reaching out to Japan to host a bilateral creditor conference to bring India and China together to talk through what can be done on the debt situation. Now, he has a lot of work to do on the foreign policy side, because the Rajapaksas really did alienate a lot of countries. So they alienated India by making a number of policy decisions that went against India's interests. They canceled a number of Japanese projects under pressure from the Chinese, and are now basically having to eat crow and say, hey, we recognize we were wrong. We didn't do the right thing. Can you help us?
So another question here related to the economic situation and the impact on the population and sort of looking forward. So obviously COVID has been a player in this crisis, depressing tourism, driving up demands, people staying home, people, losing income. And is there any possibility of any kind of a turnaround with the simple end of the pandemic, or not the end of the pandemic, but at least the easing of the pandemic, precipitate any kind of an economic improvement that might in turn ease up some of the political pressure?
So I think here is where the issue of being so heavily reliant on tourism as a source of foreign exchange comes into play. We may be entering into a recession globally. The US Fed is increasing interest rates and trying to put the US in to cool off the economy. The UK is seeing sky-high inflation. A dollar just does not go the same distance as it once did. And while there is a boom in tourism right now across the world, the question is if people start preparing for a slowdown, for an economic downturn, will they spend their money traveling to countries like Sri Lanka? And I would argue no, because everyone sees the situation in Sri Lanka. They've seen the headlines, they've seen the economic crisis there. And when you have your choice of other destinations, Sri Lanka has not meaningfully promoted itself as an attractive tourist destination. Now, they are hoping to get $10 billion in revenue from the tourism industry by 2025. That is not likely to happen. And I think when you have all these different crises happen one after the other, some of them self-inflicted, such as the constitutional crisis and the Easter bombings, those were self-inflicted. It lends itself to questions about why would people go to Sri Lanka. I personally would love to go to Sri Lanka. I think it's one of the best countries there is. It is beautiful, and the Sri Lankan people don't deserve what the politicians have done to it. But ultimately, though, at the end of the day, it is the foreign exchange crisis that needs to be dealt with. For tourism to pick back up, there needs to be political stability, and there needs to be a resolving of the debt crisis before I think you'll see the large-scale tourism return.
Thank you. And I'm also, just as you're giving that answer, I'm seeing parallels. For example, Tunisia, a very similar situation where so much of the foreign currency is, banking on tourism. And again, you have a Islamic terrorist attack. You have these sort of self-inflicted wounds, and it becomes very, very difficult for the country to dig itself out of that. Unfortunately, what you see there is increasing authoritarianism, as opposed to, instability as well, but the real sort of rebound of authoritarianism. Another question here of sort of thinking about other actors in the region. So I'm personally wondering, how India is looking at this crisis. What are their concerns? Are they concerned about any kind of a resurgence of instability in the north? What about Pakistan, but also some of the other actors in the region? Are they concerned about the situation there? And is there anything that these other players in the region can do?
So India is concerned for a number of reasons. One, they've been vying for influence with China in Sri Lanka because a lot of port traffic goes through the port of Colombo and goes on to India. From a maritime security perspective, from an economic standpoint, and also from a refugee standpoint, India is very much concerned about a potential flow of refugees from Sri Lanka into states such as Tamil Nadu. Mm-hmm. And this is always kind of an issue in India, where you see the chief minister of Tamil Nadu speaking with Prime Minister Modi. At the same time, you see kind of issues relating to Tamils in Sri Lanka. That's where domestic politics in India affects foreign policy. We tend to think about it with the rising violence against Muslims and how that affects India's foreign policy towards the UAE and Bangladesh, but very much so in Tamil Nadu, even though the BJP is not competitive there, the BJP is the ruling party in India. Even though they're not competitive there, it is still a major concern for the political parties in Tamil Nadu about the economic deterioration in Sri Lanka. Now, when you look at other countries in the region, Bangladesh was on the up and up. It provided Sri Lanka with a currency swap, the first time it had ever executed a currency swap. This caught a lot of people by surprise because Bangladesh is not known for currency swaps, and it pointed to the innovativeness of Sri Lanka trying to find alternative source of revenue when other pathways are closed off. But Bangladesh is now facing its own problems because of the rising cost of imports, because of rising energy prices. I mean, Bangladesh is also experiencing blackouts, and they've had to raise fuel prices by over 50%, which has caused protests in Bangladesh as well. Bangladesh now has to compete with, even though it has LNG, it now has to import LNG, and it's now competing with European countries for a limited amount of non-Russian LNG. And so that has caused the price of long-term LNG contracts to spike, and Bangladesh does not have the money to do so. So while Bangladesh was emerging on the world stage and trying to use Sri Lanka as a way to introduce itself to the world, unfortunately, domestic economic issues are preventing it from taking it forward. And I would say the same thing in Pakistan. So Prime Minister Imran Khan visited Sri Lanka. He was set to address Parliament, but under pressure from India, that speech was canceled. He did meet with the Rajapaksas, but at the same, Pakistan can't afford to offer any financial help to Sri Lanka. Pakistan only has foreign exchange reserves for 45 days. It is been negotiating the resumption of a stalled IMF program. The executive board is expected to approve that this week. Now that Pakistan's got the additional financing from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, and from the UAE, but ultimately they don't have the money. Pakistan is also facing a food crisis because climate change has affected Pakistan very badly, and their wheat and crop output is not what they expected to. Could this be solved by India and Pakistan trading with one another? Absolutely. South Asia is one of the least connected regions in the world, if not the least connected region in the world. But because of geopolitical rivalries, that's just not happening. And so Pakistan itself is not in a position to help out Sri Lanka. Now, Bangladesh, Nepal, the Maldives, etc., all of them are facing their own debt crises. But what they've done is they've learned from the Sri Lankan experience. So it's unfortunate, but that's been the lesson, is what not to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, this has been really comprehensive, also sobering, and you can kind of see how Sri Lanka and these countries are really caught in this vice between all of these external pressures, climate, internal pressures, all of these legacies of corruption. But I always get in trouble with the members that I'm always, showing them stuff that is gloomy. And so I want to ask, if there was going to be a positive outcome, tell us what it might look like, what might potentially turn things around in a positive way. Where is the potential for improvement? Is it with the people? Is it with any particular actor coming in? Where can we see some sunshine in this picture? Or is there none?
Well, I would say one of the biggest pieces of sunshine is the resiliency of the Sri Lankan people. I think despite pressures from the government, despite emergency curfew orders, despite threats to arrest, they still showed up, and even without fuel, they still managed to make it to the protest sites. And the protests were peaceful. Even when they were instigated, they were peaceful protests. Maybe some bad apples burnt down houses. It's still questionable about who actually did that. but you saw how much fun they had when they got into the presidential palace. I mean, doing WWE style moves on the president's bed, going for a swim. I think my favorite image was they found an Australian guy who was there, and they sat him at the head of the table and called him IMF, and decided to conduct the IMF negotiations with him. So it's a good sense of fun. And I think that is heartening to see, is that despite all these struggles, the resiliency and the enthusiasm that they have hasn't been broken. I think that is something to be said. And heck, they managed to topple a president who won by 10 points just 2 years ago. They managed to topple a prime minister whose party won 2/3 of the seats in parliament. So I think that is something that I continue to admire, and they haven't lost their spirit, which is very heartening to see.
I'm glad that you said that, because one of the things that so I spent a lot of time in Egypt and the Middle East more broadly. And when I was watching those scenes that you were describing and watching the protests, there was something very familiar about it. It had a definite Arab Spring quality, and you could see that euphoria that in fact they had been able to achieve this through peaceful protests. So I really appreciate that. Julie, do you have any final reflections on this for our guest?
This has been really enlightening. It's not a country that I think that people know that much about, and it's a very complex and interesting country. And you're right, those pictures of the, protesters, but they were just calmly hanging out in the president's house. And it was a stark juxtaposition with the January 6th hearings here that were going on, which was really interesting. I really appreciate learning about this. I feel like you're right that one of the big problems is for any government that finds itself in this position is having to implement these difficult economic policies, and how in a democracy that's hard to do and stay in power. So I guess time will tell. It also is, I feel badly for Sri Lanka that they had sort of this perfect storm of issues. Like they had the poor management of their economy, but then combined with COVID and the war between Russia and Ukraine, I didn't realize that was the bulk of their tourist industry. So it's been really interesting learning more about that.
Also, just on that, I mean, the spillover effects of China's zero COVID policy.
Oh, yeah.
I think that also doesn't get talked about. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, that's also something that really doesn't get talked about, is that if they wanted Chinese tourists to come, Chinese tourists would have to spend 3 weeks in quarantine. So they focus more on domestic tourism than international tourism. So when you remove Russia, Ukraine, and Chinese tourists, who do you have left?
That is such an important point, and also one that I think is really important for American audiences and Western audiences to hear. We often forget that much of the world looks east, looks south, looks in different directions, and is therefore impacted by changes in currents in those different places. And so it's an important thing to point out. I want to thank both of you. Akhil, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. As I said in the beginning, Sri Lanka is a country that when I was doing my research, it always sort of kept popping up, and it was one of those places I always wanted to learn more about. And so I really appreciate you sharing these insights, giving us this, detailed background for why it's in the crisis that it's in now, but also for connecting it to all of these different regional dynamics, because these are issues that we will continue to explore as we go through the rest of the fall. So thank you both very, very much for that. I want to thank the World Affairs Council audience, as always, for their wonderful questions, and to thank our sponsors, Bill Hall, Pat Finnegan, Thomas Moser, and I'm going to try to also show you that we have a fascinating speaker series coming up. You thought this evening was great. It's just the beginning. Our next event is on September 15th. It's actually an in-person event. It'll be at the law offices of Bernstein Shore, and we will be having Ryan Haas from the Brookings Institute. He will be coming to talk about Taiwan in US-China relations. And then after that, our next webinar, I need to point out that those of you who received a postcard from me, there was, of course, a typo. And the next webinar will be what's next for Iran, and that will be on the 21st of September. So thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you at some upcoming events. And again, to our moderator and our guests this evening, we really appreciate you being with us. So everyone, have a wonderful evening. Thank you. All right. Good night.